The dinner table went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before a storm breaks a window, not empty, just holding its breath. My name is Mara. I'm 34, an ICU nurse at Cedar Falls Memorial, and on the night I'm about to tell you about, I was sitting at my mother-in-law's mahogany table watching my 7-year-old son freeze halfway between his chair and the hallway. One small hand still holding the roll he'd asked to be excused to go wash off his fingers. "He's not really family," Carol had said. Not loud. She never said anything loud. She said it the way she corrected a place setting, matter of fact, already moving on, already reaching for the gravy boat, while she nodded her chin toward the doorway, toward my son, like she was directing traffic. I want you to understand something before I go further. I had heard versions of that sentence for 4 years. Small, deniable versions. The kind you can convince yourself you misheard or misread, or were too tired to interpret generously. This was not the first time Carol Whitfield had drawn a line around who belonged in her family and who was, at best, a long-term guest. It was simply the first time she'd drawn it out loud, in front of everyone, with her grandson standing in the doorway holding a dinner roll like it was suddenly too heavy to carry. I should back up. I met Daniel Whitfield 6 years ago at a continuing education conference in Columbus, of all places. I was there for a trauma nursing certification. He was there because his firm had a booth 2 rows down selling hospital wing renovations to anyone who'd listen. He had a way of listening that undid me a little. Not performing interest, actually listening, the way some people actually taste food instead of just eating it. I had a 2-year-old at the time. Eli's biological father had left before Eli turned 1, and by the time I met Daniel, I had built a life that didn't have room in it for anyone who couldn't handle coming in second to a toddler with an ear infection. Daniel came in second without complaint. He came to Eli's first day of kindergarten before he and I were even engaged. He learned to do the specific hair part Eli likes, the one I always get slightly crooked. He asked me, 8 months into dating, if it would be all right, his word, all right, like he was asking permission to enter a house he already loved if Eli started calling him dad. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We married 4 years ago in a backyard in September, string lights in the trees, Eli in a little navy suit he was so proud of he wouldn't take the jacket off even during cake. Carol was there. She wore beige. She hugged me with her arms, but not her shoulders, the kind of hug where you can feel the person counting the seconds until it's socially acceptable to let go. I told myself it was nerves. Mother-in-laws are supposed to be a little cold at first, aren't they? I told myself a lot of things in those years, and that's part of what this story is about, not just what Carol did, but what I let myself not see, because looking directly at it would have meant admitting how much was actually at stake. Daniel is the younger of Carol's 2 children. His sister Jenna, 30, unmarried, lives 15 minutes from their parents and has for her whole adult life. She works in wealth management downtown, a fact that will matter more than it seems to right now. Their father, Richard, is 66, retired civil engineer, a quiet man who has spent 40 years married to a woman who does not leave room in a conversation for someone else's silence. I used to think Richard was simply passive. I know now that passive and exhausted are not the same thing, and it took me most of these 6 years to understand the difference. The Whitfields are not flashy people. Cedar Falls isn't a flashy town. It's the kind of mid-size Ohio city where everyone's grandparents worked at the same 3 factories, where the country club is modest and everyone still calls it fancy. But the Whitfields have money. Old money. The kind that's been sitting in a trust since Daniel's grandfather sold a manufacturing patent in the 70s, money that Carol has managed guarded, really since Richard's father passed it down 20 years ago. There's a phrase Carol likes, what's meant to stay in the family stays in the family. I heard her say it about China. I heard her say it about the lake house. I did not understand, for a long time, that she also meant it about people. That night, the night I'm telling you about, was Thanksgiving. Eli had asked to be excused to wash cranberry sauce off his hands, and in the 3 seconds it took him to push back his chair, Carol had leaned toward Jenna and said the sentence that ended everything as I understood it. He's not really family. Pointing with her chin at the doorway my son was standing in. Daniel didn't say anything for a full 4 seconds. I counted them later, replaying the tape in my head the way you replay a car accident, trying to locate the exact moment before the crash where you could have turned the wheel. What my husband did next is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. But we have a long way to go before we get there. I need to tell you about the ordinary years first, because if you only hear about the explosion, you'll never understand the years of quiet, unremarkable pressure building underneath it. And if you've ever sat at a family dinner smiling while something inside you kept doing small, careful math, who was included, who wasn't, who got asked twice if they wanted more, and who got asked once, you already know exactly the kind of arithmetic I mean. For most of our marriage, life with the Whitfields was simply fine. Not warm, not cruel, fine, in the specific way that lets you avoid a harder conversation for years. Sunday dinners. Birthday cards. 2 separate ones, always one for Daniel's side of the family that included Eli's name typed alongside the others, and one, smaller, that Carol sent Eli directly, that never once, in 6 years, included the word grandson. I noticed. Of course I noticed. I filed it under things I would deal with someday, in the vague, undefined future where I had more energy than I had raising a child and working 12-hour shifts. That's the version of me you're about to spend the next several hours with, a woman who saw the pattern early and chose, again and again, not to look at it directly. Because looking at it meant admitting how much I had built our life on a hope I couldn't fully verify. If you've ever done that, build a life on a hope you were too afraid to test, stay with me. Because I did finally test it. And what I found underneath cost me more than I expected, and gave me back more than I thought I had left to reclaim. Our house sits on Larkspur Lane, a street with too many maple trees and not enough parking, in the kind of neighborhood where you know your neighbors' dogs by name before you know their last names. Daniel designed half the renovation himself, knocked out a wall between the kitchen and the dining room so I could watch Eli do homework at the counter while I cooked, which sounds like a small thing until you've spent a year in a house where you can't see your kid from the stove. Weekday mornings had a rhythm. Coffee before 6, because my shifts started at 7. Daniel handled Eli's breakfast and backpack most days, the two of them arguing cheerfully about whether cereal counted as a hot breakfast if you microwaved the milk. I'd get home at 7:30 the next morning some weeks, bone-tired, and find a drawing Eli had made taped to the fridge, dinosaurs, mostly, or our whole family standing in a row, always in the same order. Me, Daniel, Eli, our dog Biscuit. Never Carol or Richard in those drawings, not because Eli disliked them, but because a 7-year-old draws who feels like his. I didn't think anything of that at the time. I think about it constantly now. The first sign, the one I can name clearly, looking back, though I waved it off completely in the moment, came at Eli's kindergarten graduation, 2 years into our marriage. Small ceremony, paper hats, a folding chair auditorium that smelled like a gymnasium, because it was one. Carol came. She sat in the second row. When the teacher called Eli's name and he ran up grinning with his diploma, Carol clapped along with everyone else, polite, even. But afterward, in the parking lot, I heard her say to Jenna, not to me, never quite to me, it's sweet, watching him. Reminds me of your cousin's kids. Your cousin's kids. Not my grandson. A comparison instead of a claim. I told myself I'd misheard the tone. I told Daniel about it that night, folded into the specific, careful language you use when you're not sure you're allowed to be upset yet. It's probably nothing, but, and he frowned, said he'd talk to her, and then, in the exhausting way life works, didn't. Because the next week his firm landed a hospital contract that ate every free hour he had for 2 months. I let it go. Not because it didn't matter. Because I didn't know yet how much it would. That's the thing nobody tells you about red flags. They rarely arrive as flags. They arrive as sentences you almost didn't hear, said by people who are careful never to say them twice in the same way. The second sign came slower, spread across nearly a year, so gradual I didn't recognize it as a pattern until much later. The holiday seating chart. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, Carol arranged place cards, actual cards, calligraphed, a habit from some long ago era of formal dinners she never gave up. For 3 years running, Eli's card sat at the far end of the table, past the kids section that didn't otherwise exist, next to no one his age, next to Richard's elderly aunt who mostly slept through dessert. I moved his card myself, twice, without saying anything, slid it up beside mine before anyone sat down. Carol never commented. She also never stopped placing it back at the far end the following year. I remember standing in Carol's kitchen during the second Christmas, drawing a serving dish that didn't need drying, just to have something to do with my hands, watching her arrange a tray of deviled eggs with the kind of precision she brought to everything, and thinking, clearly in words, she does this on purpose. And then, just as clearly, talking myself out of the thought, because the alternative, that my mother-in-law had spent 3 years quietly, deliberately signaling that my son didn't belong at the center of her table, was too large a thing to hold while also making sure the eggs got passed around before they went cold. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the part people skip over when they tell these stories, and it's the part that matters most. I didn't miss the pattern because I was foolish. I missed it because naming it meant doing something about it, and doing something about it meant risking the one thing I had built my whole adult life around, a family that felt, finally, whole. If you've ever kept quiet about something because speaking it out loud would cost you more than staying silent, you already understand exactly what those Christmases felt like. Daniel, for his part, was distracted in ways I chalked up entirely to work. Looking back, I can see it differently. There were evenings, that second year, when he'd come off the phone with his mother looking like someone who'd just set something heavy down and wasn't sure his arms still worked right. He never told me what those calls were about. When I asked, he'd say the usual and change the subject with a kind of practiced smoothness that I now understand was its own kind of tell, a man protecting me, he thought, from something he hadn't figured out how to fight yet. There was a night, near the end of that second year, when I woke at 2 a.m. and found him at the kitchen table with his laptop open and his father's old briefcase, the leather one Richard had given him when he graduated college. The one Daniel used maybe twice a year for anything formal, sitting open beside him, papers spread out in a way that looked less like bedtime reading and more like an audit. He closed the laptop fast when I came in. Said he couldn't sleep, said it was nothing, kissed my forehead, and steered me back to bed with his hand at the small of my back. I let him. I was tired. I had a 7 a.m. shift. I told myself whatever it was, he'd bring it to me when he was ready. That's my flaw, if I'm honest with you, and I'll be honest with you throughout this whole story, because there's no version of it that means anything if I only tell you about what was done to me and never about what I did, or didn't do, in return. I knew early that something in that family didn't sit right where my son was concerned. And I chose, over and over, not to look at it directly, because looking meant risking a peace I had fought hard to build, and some quiet, cowardly part of me decided a fragile peace was better than an honest war. I didn't know yet how much that choice would cost. Eli turned 7 that spring. Daniel threw him a dinosaur-themed party in the backyard, homemade fossil dig in a sandbox, a cake shaped like a T-Rex that came out slightly lopsided, and that Eli declared, generously, the best one ever. Carol sent a card. No gift. Jenna came in person with a gift, a nice one, a real telescope, the kind of present that made Eli's whole face light up, and I remember feeling grateful to her in a way that, later, would curdle into something far more complicated. If you've ever mistaken someone's kindness for loyalty, you already know exactly where this is going. The unease that had lived quietly in the back of my chest for 2 years started, that spring, to move. It started with paperwork, or rather, with the absence of paperwork where I expected some. Daniel had mentioned, months earlier, almost offhand, that his grandfather's trust was due for a routine review that year, some legal formality tied to the terms of how it distributed to the next generation, once Richard and Carol were gone. He'd mentioned it the way you mention a dentist appointment, necessary, boring, nothing to think twice about. I hadn't thought twice about it. Trusts and legal documents were his family's business, handled by lawyers in an office downtown I'd never once set foot in, and I had never asked to be included, because it never occurred to me there was anything to be excluded from. That changed on a Tuesday in April, when Eli came home from a weekend at Carol and Richard's, a rare overnight, one Carol herself had suggested, which should have been its own red flag given how carefully she usually managed her exposure to him, and mentioned, completely without weight, the way children mention things that seem enormous to adults and ordinary to them, that Grandma Carol had a locked box in her office that Grandpa Richard wasn't allowed to touch either. I laughed it off at dinner. Told Daniel later, as a funny anecdote, your mother has a locked box. Very mysterious. Very Nancy Drew. Daniel didn't laugh. He went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid math behind his eyes, and said, too quickly, that it was probably just her jewelry. I believed him. I want you to understand that. I believed my husband because 6 years of marriage had given me no reason not to, and because the alternative, that he knew something about that box and wasn't telling me, required a kind of suspicion I hadn't yet built the muscle for. The behavioral shift in Daniel, over the following weeks, was small enough that I explained each instance away individually and only understood the pattern much later. He started taking calls from Jenna in the garage, door shut, a habit he'd never had before. He started checking the mail before I got to it, not obviously, but I noticed, the way you notice your husband is suddenly always the one who walks to the mailbox, always has a reason to be the one holding whatever came that day. Once, I asked what a particular thick envelope from a law firm was, and he said, just the trust review stuff, boring, and put it in his bag before I could see the letterhead clearly. I didn't push. I told myself pushing wasn't necessary between two people who trusted each other completely, and some small, honest corner of my mind noted, quietly, that I was using the word trust as a reason not to ask a question, instead of as something two people build by actually answering each other. I want to stop here again, because this is the part where the pressure stopped being something I could dismiss and started being something I carried in my body. I started sleeping worse. Not dramatically, just an extra 20 minutes lying awake before it took, a habit of waking at 3 a.m. and lying still, listening to Daniel breathe, running through conversations that hadn't happened yet. I started, without deciding to, eating less at family dinners, some low hum of vigilance sitting where my appetite used to be. My hands, twice that spring, shook slightly, pouring coffee, not from caffeine. I knew my own body too well for that excuse, but from something with no name yet, something that lived just under my ribs and made itself known at the worst possible moments, usually right as Carol's name came up in conversation. Some of you already know this feeling. The one where your body starts keeping score before your mind is willing to admit there's a game being played. I found out, eventually, what the locked box wasn't. It wasn't jewelry. It was a stretch of about 6 weeks, May into June, where I started paying closer attention, not because I'd made some grand decision to investigate my mother-in-law, but because small inconsistencies had accumulated past the point where ignoring them took less energy than noticing them. Carol mentioned, at a Sunday dinner, something about updating the beneficiary language in a tone that assumed everyone at the table already understood what she meant. Richard, beside her, went quiet in a way that struck me, for the first time, as not passive but careful, the silence of a man choosing his battles and losing most of them before he even started. I asked Daniel about it in the car on the way home. He gave me the shortest answer he'd ever given me about anything related to his family. It's fine, Mara. It's just legal stuff. I've got it handled, and something in the word handled landed wrong. Not because it was a lie exactly. Because it was the kind of thing you say when you're trying to carry something alone that's too heavy to carry alone, and I recognized it. Because it's exactly what I'd been doing for 2 years about the place cards and the birthday envelopes and the sentence I'd overheard in the kitchen once about your cousin's kids. That night I did something I'd never done in 6 years of marriage. I looked through Daniel's home office, not snooping, I told myself, just looking, the distinction feeling thinner every year I've had to sit with what I found. There wasn't much. A folder, unlabeled, in the bottom drawer of his desk, containing what looked like drafts of correspondence between Carol and a lawyer I didn't recognize. Whitcomb, the letterhead said, dated over the past 8 months. I didn't read closely. I told myself I would, later, when I had more time, when I was ready. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, angled the same way, and closed the drawer. If you've ever found the first piece of something you weren't ready to understand yet and put it back exactly where it was, you already know that this isn't cowardice. It's pacing. It's the body protecting itself from more truth than it can process in one sitting. I know some of you already sense where this is going. I didn't. Not yet. What I found in that folder, when I finally let myself really read it 3 weeks later, changed the shape of every year I'd spent at that table smiling and passing the gravy. Stay with me, because what came next is the part where the ground actually started to move. June arrived heavy that year, the kind of Ohio humidity that sits on your chest before you've done anything to earn it. I worked 4 12-hour shifts that week, came home each time to a house that felt slightly unfamiliar, the specific unfamiliarity of a place you love where you've started to suspect something is being hidden from you inside its walls. I went back to the folder on a Thursday, my day off, while Daniel was at a site visit and Eli was at day camp. I sat at his desk in his office, a fact that felt significant in a way I couldn't name at the time, and I read. The correspondence wasn't a smoking gun on its own. Lawyers write carefully, and Whitcomb, whoever he was, wrote like a man paid by the hour to say as little as possible while saying it very precisely. But across 8 months of drafts, a shape emerged. Carol had initiated, the previous fall, right around the second Christmas, right around the place cards moved to the far end of the table, a formal review of the family trust's distribution language. The original document, drawn up by Daniel's grandfather decades earlier, used the phrase issue of the beneficiaries, standard legal language meaning children and grandchildren by blood or legal adoption. Carol's proposed amendment narrowed it. Biological issue and legally adopted issue prior to the age of 5. A specific surgical carve-out. Eli, adopted informally in every way that mattered but never legally, because his biological father had never been located to terminate parental rights, a fact Daniel and I had simply been too busy, too in love, too avoidant to resolve in the paperwork sense, fell outside every version of that language. I sat very still for a long time after I understood what I was reading. My chest did the tight thing it had been doing more often that spring. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that, how much easier it would have been to cry, and how instead I just sat there doing the math Carol had apparently been doing for 8 months, converting my son from a person into a clause. There was a second document in the folder, further back, that I understood less clearly at the time and would only fully understand in October, an email chain between Carol and Jenna, dated back further than I expected, nearly a year, discussing, in language careful enough that I initially misread its intent, the timeline for finalizing things before year-end, for tax purposes. At the time I filed it as boring financial planning. I didn't yet know that Jenna wasn't simply aware of what her mother was doing. She was the one managing the numbers on the other end, because a trust amendment that shrinks the pool of eligible heirs increases the share available to everyone still in it, and Jenna, 30 and unmarried and childless, stood to gain considerably more than her brother's family if that pool shrank by exactly one 7-year-old boy. I put the folder back. I did not confront anyone. I did not tell Daniel what I'd found, not yet, a choice I still turn over, some nights, wondering if it was protection or cowardice, and landing most nights on the answer that it was both. I told myself I needed to be sure. I told myself I needed to see how it played out before I set fire to a family Daniel loved, even a family that had begun, quietly and surgically, trying to write my son out of its future. If you've ever held proof of something and put it back exactly where you found it, just to buy yourself one more day of not knowing what to do with it, you understand exactly the position I was in that June. I want to pause here at the heaviest part of the stretch, because I think some of you are sitting with something similar right now. Maybe not a trust document. Maybe just a feeling you've been talking yourself out of for months. I want to say clearly, the fact that you haven't acted on it yet doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're still gathering the courage the situation actually requires. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Something in Daniel had been changing too, and by midsummer I could no longer explain it away as work stress. He'd started coming home and going straight to Eli, not just the usual affectionate greeting, but something closer to checking, the way you check a smoke detector after you've smelled something burning somewhere in the house and can't locate the source. He held Eli a beat too long at bedtime some nights. He started asking me, out of nowhere, over dishes, whether I thought Eli felt like he belonged in this family, a question so specific and so unprompted that I nearly told him, right then, what I'd found in his desk drawer. I didn't. I asked him instead what had prompted the question. He said his mother had said something at lunch that bothered him, wouldn't elaborate, changed the subject with the same practiced smoothness from before. But this time something in his jaw stayed tight for the rest of the evening, a small muscle working near his ear that I'd never noticed before and now couldn't stop noticing. She told me much later what was actually happening around that time, not Carol. Daniel. This is what he told me he'd been living through that summer, in his own words, once I finally understood enough to ask the right questions. My mother called me into her office. She calls it that, the sunroom with the desk in it, her office. And she had the amendment printed out, sitting there like she expected me to just sign off on it as a formality. She said it was about protecting the family's assets, being responsible with what Grandpa built. She didn't say Eli's name once. Not once, in a 20-minute conversation about writing him out of my father's will. I told her I needed time to think. She said there wasn't much time. Whitcomb wanted it finalized before year-end. I left her office and sat in my car in her driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home, because I didn't know yet how to tell my wife that my mother had just asked me to choose. That's what he was carrying, that summer, while I was carrying my own version of the same secret in a folder I kept putting back exactly where I found it. Neither of us said anything to the other. Two people in the same house, circling the same wound, each convinced the other needed protecting from it. The engagement moment, the thing that finally cracked something open, happened at the end of July, at a barbecue Carol hosted for Richard's birthday, and it's the kind of small, ordinary moment that I still think about more than almost anything else that happened that year. If you've ever had a stranger's small kindness reveal something enormous about the people who were supposed to love you best, stay with me, because that's exactly what happened next. Richard's birthday party was the kind of event Carol staged rather than hosted, matching napkins, a caterer for a backyard of 40 people, a banner that said Happy 66th in gold script that probably cost more than it should have. Eli spent most of the afternoon at the edge of the yard with Richard's neighbor's kid, a girl about his age named Priya, building something elaborate out of sticks near the fence line, blissfully unaware of anything happening at the tables behind him. It was Priya's mother, a woman I'd met maybe twice, who said the thing that finally moved something in me past the point of return. She came over to refill her lemonade near where I was standing and said, warmly, gesturing toward the kids, "Your son's so sweet with her. He told her all about his grandpa's telescope. He said his whole family gave it to him for his birthday. A small thing. An accidental catalyst, the kind no one plans." She had no idea what she'd just done, mentioning, in passing, that my son believed, genuinely, uncomplicatedly believed, that the family currently drafting legal language to remove him from its future had given him a gift as a unit, out of love, as his whole family. Something in me went very quiet and very clear at the same time. I remember looking across the yard at Carol, laughing at something Jenna's coworker had said, holding a glass of white wine with the specific elegance she brought to everything, and understanding, fully, that I could not carry this alone for one more season. Not because I was angry, though I was, but because my son believed something that wasn't true, and every day I let that belief stand unchallenged, I was choosing Carol's comfort over Eli's dignity. I told Daniel everything that night. All of it, the folder, the amendment, the months I'd known, and said nothing. I braced for him to be angry that I'd gone through his desk, that I'd sat on it for weeks. He wasn't. He put his head in his hands at our kitchen table and told me everything he'd been carrying since spring, his mother's ultimatum, the 40 minutes in the driveway, the months of trying to find a way to fight her without breaking his family apart in the process. Without knowing, I already had the proof sitting in a folder 2 rooms away the entire time. "We should have told each other months ago," he said. "We're telling each other now," I said, and meant it as the beginning of something, not an apology for the delay. We agreed, together, for the first time in this whole ordeal, actually together, that we would not go into Thanksgiving pretending. Daniel called Whitcomb's office directly that week and requested, in writing, full copies of every draft amendment discussed over the past year, a request that, under the trust's own terms as a named beneficiary, he had every right to make. What came back confirmed everything and added one detail neither of us had known. The amendment wasn't simply pending. Carol had already secured Richard's signature on a preliminary codicil that sprang the same spring as the locked box, the same spring as the 40 minutes in the driveway, a signature Richard later told Daniel, quietly, he'd given to keep the peace, without fully grasping, in the moment, exactly what he was signing away. That detail is the one that still sits heaviest with me. Not Carol's cruelty. I had, by then, made a kind of peace with expecting it. Richard's exhausted compliance. 40 years of a marriage that had taught a good man it was easier to sign than to argue. We went to Thanksgiving anyway. Daniel insisted, and I understood why, not to perform normalcy, but because he wanted the truth to surface in his mother's own house, at her own table, in front of the people whose opinion she'd spent a lifetime curating. I brought the copy of the amendment folded, in my bag. I didn't plan to use it unless I had to. The table that night held 12 people, Carol and Richard, Jenna, Daniel, Eli, myself, Richard's older sister Diane. 2 of Jenna's co-workers Carol had invited to round out the numbers, and Carol's longtime friend Louise, who came to every holiday and said very little. The turkey had just been carved when Eli asked to be excused to wash the cranberry sauce off his fingers, and in the small window of his chair scraping back, Carol leaned toward Jenna and said it. He's not really family. I felt the words land in my chest exactly where the tightness had been living all year, except this time it didn't feel like anxiety. It felt like confirmation. I went very still, not from weakness, but from the sheer size of finally hearing, out loud, at full volume in front of witnesses, the thing I'd spent 2 years half believing I'd imagined. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He stood, slowly, and walked to where his mother sat and set the folded amendment on the table in front of her plate, beside the cranberry sauce, without a word. Carol looked at it, looked at him, and said nothing. I watched my husband do something I will remember for the rest of my life. He didn't argue. He didn't perform outrage for the table's benefit. He said, quietly, evenly, Eli is my son. He has been my son since he was 2 years old. If the trust doesn't have language for that, we'll fix the language. We will not fix him. Then he turned to the doorway, where Eli still stood, roll forgotten in his hand, uncertain whether he was allowed to come back to the table, and said, "Come sit next to me, Bud," and pulled out the chair beside his own. Not the far end of the table where Carol's place cards always sent him, but right beside his father, in the middle of everything. Carol said nothing. Not a denial, not an apology, not even an excuse. She looked at the paper in front of her for a long moment, then folded her hands and looked straight ahead, the specific composed silence of a woman who had decided, on the spot, that this confrontation was not one she intended to lose by engaging with it. It was the same silence I'd catalogued for 2 years across a dozen small moments, the place cards, the birthday cards, the sentence about her cousin's kids, except now, finally, everyone at the table could see it for what it was. Richard broke first, in his own quiet way, not dramatic, just a long exhale, and the words, "Carol, that's enough," said low, said like a man finally spending 40 years of saved-up breath in one sentence. Jenna's face went through something complicated. I watched her calculate, in real time, whether to defend her mother or distance herself, and watched her choose, in the end, silence, which told me everything about where her loyalties had actually lived all along. Louise set down her fork. Diane looked at her plate. The 2 coworkers stared at nothing in particular, the specific paralysis of guests who've wandered into a fight that predates them by years. And the table, exactly as I'd tell you later, went completely silent, but it was 2 different silences sitting across from each other. Mine was the silence of someone who had finally, fully understood something she'd spent 2 years refusing to look at directly. Carol's was the silence of someone who had been told the truth in front of witnesses and decided, rather than break, to simply refuse to answer it at all. Neither silence said forgive me. Neither one said I was wrong. But only one of them was standing up for a 7-year-old boy who just wanted to wash cranberry sauce off his hands and come back to a table where he belonged. And by the end of that dinner, everyone in that room knew exactly which one. The weeks after Thanksgiving were quieter than I expected, and not in a peaceful way, in the way a house is quiet after someone has finally stopped pretending the foundation isn't cracked. Carol didn't call to apologize. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there's a version of this story you might expect, the tearful reconciliation, the grandmother who finally sees the error of her ways. That isn't what happened, and I've made peace with the fact that it never will. What happened instead was smaller and, in its way, more honest. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Daniel got a call from her, not an apology, but an explanation delivered in the clipped, composed voice she used for everything, the same voice she'd used at the table. He put it on speaker without telling her, and I heard most of it standing in our kitchen with a dish towel still in my hand. This is close to what she told him, in her own words, once her silence had finally worn thin enough to let something out. I know what you think of me right now, and I know I'm not going to change your mind tonight. But I want you to understand where this came from, because it didn't come from nowhere. My mother-in-law did the same thing to me 40 years ago, different reasons, different language, but the same math, deciding who counted and who didn't, and I swore I'd never let anyone treat me the way she treated me. I built this family security with my own hands, Daniel. Every trust review, every document, every hour with Whitcomb, that was me making sure nothing could ever be taken from this family the way things were nearly taken from us when your father's business partner tried to sue us in the 80s. I know how that sounds now. I know it sounds like control. Maybe it is. But I have spent my whole life protecting what's ours, and somewhere along the way protecting it became the same thing as deciding who is allowed to be part of it. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why that's unforgivable to you right now. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know it wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was fear wearing a very expensive coat, and I've been wearing it so long I stopped being able to take it off. Daniel didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, he said only, "That doesn't change what you said in front of my son," and ended the call. I won't pretend that explanation undid anything. It didn't. But I understood, hearing it, something about Carol I hadn't let myself consider before, that cruelty this precise, this sustained, usually comes from somewhere. Even when the person delivering it never earns the right to have that origin excuse the damage. Carol lost something that mattered to her that Thanksgiving, and it wasn't subtle. She lost Richard's silence, which had been the load-bearing wall of her authority in that house for 40 years. And once he said that's enough in front of witnesses, he kept saying it. He pushed back, gently but consistently, on the trust amendment, insisting, with Daniel's lawyer now formally involved, that Eli be named explicitly, by name, not by the ambiguous language of issue. Carol lost that fight. The amended language, finalized the following spring, reads simply, including Eli Whitfield, adopted son of Daniel Whitfield, as full beneficiary alongside all other grandchildren, biological or otherwise. Carol signed it. She didn't have a choice by then. Richard and Daniel, together, made sure of that. Jenna lost something too, though it took her longer to understand what. Once it became clear, through the documents Whitcomb's office was legally required to produce, exactly how involved she'd been in structuring the amendment's tax timeline, how much she stood to personally gain from Eli's exclusion. Daniel stopped including her in anything that mattered. Not a dramatic rupture. Just a slow, permanent narrowing of what she was allowed close to. She still comes to holidays. She sits further from the center of things now, and she knows why, and nobody has to say it out loud. I left that dinner table a different woman than I sat down as, and it took months to understand what the difference actually was. I stopped, somewhere in that winter, waiting for Carol's approval as a condition of my own sense of belonging. I stopped moving Eli's place card and started simply setting the table myself when we hosted, which we started doing more of. Thanksgiving moved to our house the following year, cranberry sauce and all, Eli's chair right in the middle. No far end of any table for him to be exiled to ever again. Looking back now, the red flag I most regret missing wasn't the place cards, or the birthday envelopes, or even the sentence about her cousin's kids. It was the 2 years I spent calling my own unease probably nothing, because naming it honestly would have meant admitting how much was actually at risk. I understand something now I didn't understand then. Denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you think you're ready to pay, until the day it costs you something you're no longer willing to lose. Eli is 9 now. He still draws our family in a row: me, Daniel, him, Biscuit, though Biscuit's gotten old and mostly just naps in the drawings these days. He doesn't remember much about that Thanksgiving specifically. What he remembers, when I've asked him gently, is that his dad pulled out the chair right next to his own and told him to come sit. That's the memory that stuck, and I've decided that's the one that should. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years managing someone else's exclusion so carefully that you convince yourself it isn't happening. I think that's the piece of this story that reaches furthest past my own kitchen table, not the trust, not even Carol specifically, but the quiet, universal habit of translating cruelty into ambiguity, because ambiguity is easier to live inside than certainty. Carol never once needed to raise her voice to make her meaning clear over 6 years, and I never once needed proof to already know, somewhere underneath the noise of daily life, what that meaning was. The proof didn't create the truth. It just finally gave me permission to stop pretending I hadn't already found it, months and years before I let myself read a single page. What stays with me isn't the confrontation itself, dramatic as it felt at the time. It's the ordinary years before it, all those Sunday dinners where I chose comfort over clarity, where I told myself love meant not asking hard questions, when in fact the people who loved Eli best in that room were the ones willing to ask them out loud, in front of everyone, at exactly the moment it mattered most. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to take from this, it's that the moment you catch yourself explaining away a pattern instead of naming it, that's usually the moment the pattern is asking to be named. You don't need the whole folder of evidence to trust what your body already knows. I had 2 years of place cards telling me the truth before I ever opened a drawer that wasn't mine to open. So maybe you already know how this part ends. Most of us do, by the time we're finally willing to look. What hurts most, even now, isn't what Carol said that night. It's how long I let myself believe I hadn't already heard it a dozen quieter times, in a dozen quieter rooms. If you've ever sat at a table where you already knew the truth and just weren't ready to say it out loud yet, I'd love to hear it. Drop one word in the comments: the person who taught you to doubt what you already knew, or the moment you finally stopped ignoring it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It's a hard story to tell, and it means something that you stayed for all of it.